Hi everyone, I'm Shannon Courtney. I'm the BPU podcast director. And before you guys watch episode 2 of the BPU podcast, Restoring Civility in American Politics, especially after the events of January 6th and the events hereafter with the inauguration of Joe Biden, we want to introduce our newest member of the podcast, Sarah. She's a podcast outreach coordinator, and she's going to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, it's really nice to be here. My name is Sarah Satude, and I'm a first year double majoring in public affairs and statistics, and I'm from the Bay Area. And I'm really excited to join BPU and be on this podcast because obviously our country is just getting increasingly polarized by the second, and I think conversation is the first step to change. So I'm really excited to be here and see where this podcast goes.
Yeah, so we're so excited to have Sarah on the podcast, and we put a lot of effort in this next episode, and we hope you enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bruin Political Union Podcast. I am your host, Mia Thorsen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Courtney. I'm the BPU podcast director.
We want to welcome you to the second episode of the Bruin Political Union Podcast, which we are titling Restoring Civility in American Politics. In this episode, we will discuss the events that occurred on January 6th, that fateful day when supporters of President Donald Trump seized the United States Capitol building to contest the 2020 election results of then President-elect, now President Joe Biden. This attack and insurrection on the U.S. Capitol has resulted in the insecurity of the United States' role as a political global power and beacon of freedom and democracy, and an even deeper divide between the already very partisan Republicans and Democrats. Therefore, today we are talking with Adrian Yu from the UCLA Roosevelt Institute about the future of bipartisanship within American politics for the common good of democracy.
Hi, welcome.
Adrian, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is Adrian Yu. I am a graduating senior at UCLA, and I am from the Roosevelt Institute at UCLA.
Yeah, so do we want to just make a formal note before we start with all the topics we're going to discuss, because I think they're really engaging and interesting. We want to make a note that this conversation does not represent entire views of Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and everything in between, and this podcast is just trying to bring a common ground for the sake of democracy in the United States. So we first want to start out getting like an in-depth overview, and then we're going to go into the different topics about what occurred on January 6th and the corresponding events that occurred afterwards. So first off, Democratic candidate, now President Joe Biden, won the 2020 United States presidential election, defeating the Republican incumbent President Trump on November 3rd, 2020. And so Trump and other Republican representatives in the House and the Senate claimed widespread voter fraud in different swing states such as Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And so Congress was scheduled to meet on January 6th, 2021 to count the Electoral College results and certify a winner of the election. So in reaction to this Electoral College vote and certification, Trump announced a rally called Save America before the vote on January 6th to challenge election results. And so Trump gave a speech declaring he would, quote, never concede the election, criticizing the media and calling for Vice President Pence to overturn the election results. And so therefore a crowd marched down Pennsylvania Avenue and met at the Capitol, and just after 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, windows were broken through, people scaled the Capitol walls, and the mob reached into the Capitol, and this led to a widespread evacuation of prominent representatives and also the Vice President Mike Pence and other senators and representatives such as Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. And so overall, the 2020 riot was the first insurrection on the U.S. Capitol and breach since the War of 1812, so it's fairly new in our history. And so after this, Congress was able to reconvene later in the evening on January 6th after the Capitol was clear of trespassers, and by 3:41 a.m., Congress confirmed the Electoral College's votes of Joe Biden and Harris being in the president and the vice president seat in the United States.
Okay, thank you, Shannon, so much. That was a very constructive and comprehensive breakdown of a very tumultuous and at times confusing series of events that we have seen recently. So I just want to go ahead and get started on our topics and some of the questions that we're going to ask you, Adrian. So our first topic is going to be the division and misunderstandings within American politics. So we first wanted to discuss the political tension within the United States between Republicans and Democrats before this event, as well as the ramifications afterward. So, if you had one thing that you wish the other side understood about your ideology or party, what would it be?
Okay, well, first of all, before we dive into what I'm sure will be a very heated discussion about politics, I want to express that the Roosevelt Institute is a nonpartisan, non-political organization, and I'll speak on behalf and as a representative of Roosevelt when I can, but I'll also talk from my point of view, which is quite partisan. Um, Something that I wish uh, the other political side knew about, I guess, my political beliefs, I think it's just a understanding of basic facts. I wish that we shared the same idea of what was true and what wasn't. I mean, if you look at what's being debated in Congress right now, it's not what it used to be. It's not like what we should prioritize or how much money should be spent in a certain issue. It's about the actual existence of things like, the vaccine, of COVID-19, of voter fraud, of climate change, and we can go on and on and on. But I think that creates a huge division between our political society. And I think that we could get so much more done if we just shared the same beliefs of, what exists and what doesn't, if we had the same truths in our lives.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that and also for that disclaimer at the top. Coming from the Bruin Political Union, we have similar views as the Roosevelt Institute in that aspect, I believe. And thank you for a very well articulated and respectful response. And I agree that it is a little bit crazy that facts are a point of contention in this moment.
Yes, very much so.
Absolutely.
So, for my next question, do you think personally Republicans are unfairly criticized based on President Trump's actions when not every Republican is a Trump supporter?
Great question. Well, first of all, I grew up in a household that was bipartisan. So my dad was a Republican from Reagan times until I think Trump in 2016. I was a Republican in the first part of my life until I realized what politics was with I think Obama in 2008. And I think from what I've observed with my family, I know that not every person who calls themselves a Republican or previously um, was a Republican has the same views as Trump. And I think that there are a lot of people out there that still believe in, what Abraham Lincoln, what Reagan believed, that we are stronger as a unified country and not weaker. And I just want to also bring up that in the 1960s, the Democrats were on the side of Jim Crow laws before the whole rearrangement, as I'm sure you guys know. Um, and so I don't think that any specific political party has an ownership of truths and facts or science. Um, and I think that when we start to talk about Democrats are all wrong or Republicans are all wrong, I think um, that's a dangerous view and a dangerous path. But at the same time, I also believe um, that if you have supported Trump after everything that we've seen in the past 4 years, I think that you are complicit in what has gone down in our country, and I don't think that actions should be forgotten or erased. Uh, yeah, and that's what I have to say about that.
Excellent. And I'm sorry for putting you in that position where we have you speaking for the entirety of the Republican Party. um, but Another very, very excellent response. Thank you
Thank
again.
you.
So we're going to go ahead and transition now into another, not to keep using this word, but it's what it is, a point of contention that we have seen arise from the events on January 6th. And that is the comparison drawn between the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and the Capitol riots.
Right.
Um, so on January 6th, the Trump base responded to an alleged call to action from the president and stormed the US Capitol building, as we know. And this
Mhm.
demonstration was destructive, and parallels were drawn between the police response on January 6th and of the Black Lives Matter marches last summer in regards to the response of law enforcement. So, my question to you is some sources are hesitant to connect the Black Lives Matter protests to the insurrection in the Capitol because of a fundamental difference in purpose and ideology. Do you think that there is still valor to that comparison?
For me personally, it was really just shocking to see the difference in how white supremacist extremists were treated by MPT, by Capitol Police. And what I think that we saw on January 6th was um, the most overt signs of white supremacy that has been existing in this country since its creation. This is not a new thing, absolutely, and neither is fighting for civil rights. I think the main difference between um, the groups that we saw on January 6th and Black Lives Matter is um, I think it's about intent. And Black Lives Matter fought for peace and freedom and then got treated with violence, while Capitol rioters who wanted to start violence to disrupt peace, they have selfies taken with them. And this also, I just want to express that this wasn't any old building. This was the temple of our democracy. This is our symbol of our way of life, and they attacked that. So I just don't see how that's just to compare them to each other.
Absolutely. And that last thing that you said is a little bit of an answer, but also a transition to our next question. So do you believe that there is any justification of the discrepancy we saw between police actions taken?
Well, um, I actually worked for the police a couple summers ago as an intern, very briefly, but I got to go on ride-alongs. I got to have training in a shooting range. I got to observe what goes on in my local police department. And I know that there are some officers who absolutely deserve to be honored for their service on January 6th. I've heard of stories where um, police officers have accounts of that event being absolutely outmanned, outgunned, and I believe, and I agree with them that if they were to shoot without the backing of National Guard, they could possibly have lost that fight. I absolutely believe that. Um, but I also think about the difference between um, where things started. So with Black Lives Matter protests, we saw people like police forces in full force, ready to enforce the law right from the get-go, right at the start of any of the Black Lives Matter marches. And the Capitol riots, I think, were a completely different thing. We saw um, officers crying for help and the president of the United States withholding the National Guard. So to, to have a long story short and rope all the way back to your original question, Mia, um, I think that there is some justification for um, police activity and being a little less uh, violent towards white supremacists, but at the same time, I also believe that we've what we saw was all with selfies being taken. As I said before, I think that's unacceptable, and there's an obvious uh, point being made in that situation where we have a long way to go, and the current we are making progress. in terms of equity, we are. It's the world is different from uh, when Martin Luther King Jr. marched and Yuri Kuchiyama marched, uh, but at the same time, it's nowhere near adequate to benefiting the real lives that are being affected now. And I think we need to make progress quicker.
So now to transition into sort of the repercussions of January 6th, um, the topic now is media, private business versus the infringement of the First Amendment. So the following day, Facebook and Instagram announced that they had banned Trump at least until the end of his presidential term because of inflammatory tweets, et cetera, et cetera. On January 8th, Twitter permanently suspended Trump due to the risk of further incitement of violence from his tweets, writing that specific tweets by Trump that are likely to inspire others to replicate the violent acts. After the events on January 6th, Parler, a free speech social network, was removed from the App Store and the Google Play Store. So, our question for you is, do you think that banning Trump and Republican platforms will further radicalize Trump supporters and push Republican messaging to non-visual places?
Um, I think that if we look at history and when when countries and societies try to block specific forms of speech, usually it finds another way to resurface. Now, at the so I to answer your question, I do think that that might happen. That's a very real possibility that we could see white nationalist dialogue happening in non-visual places. But at the same time, I think we have to give credit where credit is due, and I think that national networks spreading lies and spreading myths about election fraud. I think that that makes a huge impact, and I think that contributes to what we were talking about before, where we have two different truths. So my hope is that when national media companies no longer like spread lies or um, you know support leaders who spread lies, I think that that could possibly reduce the amount of people who hear about these lies, and I hope that that will be an effective measure.
Absolutely. Thank you. And now, follow up. Do you believe that the banning of Trump and Republican platforms had sufficient merit, or do you believe it was a violation of First Amendment rights?
You know, I think that normally, if we were to hear without context about an opposition leader being silenced, getting their most effective tool taken away from them, normally we would hear that and be like, yeah, that's wrong. We should allow free speech. I think that's in our instincts. I think that's our nature as Americans. But let's not take away from what happened on January 6th. It wasn't normal at all. It was a attack on our very democracy, on our very way of life, spurred on by our leader, the leader of the free world, one of the most powerful people on the planet. And I think that, you can't shout fire in a movie theater. You can't, yell bomb on an airplane. Those are very dangerous things. And I think that, when it endangers other people's rights, rights to security, rights to, um, feel like things are going to be okay, I think that that's totally justified.
Thank you so much. Um, so now a little bit of a transition from the constitutionality of that and more into the rights of the tech companies. So do you think that big tech companies should have this power, that this is something that they are within their rights as entities and corporations to perform?
Do you mean rights as in blocking, uh, like blocking speech, or rights as in promoting lies?
Well, I think you answered my question a little bit there, but we would say is blocking speech for the sake of the podcast.
Um, yeah, sure. So for blocking speech, um, I think that there's a difference between an organization having the ability to spread, um, any kind of messaging that they want, and the power to control elections and to control the hearts and minds of millions and millions of Americans. So I don't think that um, it's a question of whether or not companies should have the ability to do this because I think they already do. I think that we have to work on, from a policy standpoint, how do we educate the American public in a way that you know people know when there's fake media out there. Trying not to use the word fake news. Um, I I think that it starts with in schools we have uh, we don't have a complete truth in our history classes in schools. I remember, uh, and I'm going to go off on a little tangent here. I remember when I was growing up, I had two different types of history classes. Um, one in my public school and one in my Japanese school. Um, in my public school, we had maybe like a paragraph, or we spent like 15 minutes, if that, on the Japanese internment camps and a lot of people slept through it. I'm pretty sure that I like spaced out through that 15 minutes. Um, but in my Japanese school, we spent an entire day learning about the struggles of Japanese Americans in internment camps. And I think that if we focus more on media literacy, if we talk about racial equity in our education systems, I think we'll see less people being affected by um, messaging on social media and national media platforms.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point to bring up. We are, whether we like it or not, iGen, and we are, whether we like it or not, sort of the first round of people growing up in this generation. And I think we are the pioneers of navigating this, absolutely. And I think that is a wonderful maybe development that we will see in the future of American public education, or at least I hope.
I absolutely hope. Absolutely hope so too. And kind of to add on to your point, I think that while we work on educating our young people, I also think that you know social media companies and media organizations have the power to regulate. We've seen that with um, taking Trump off of these platforms, and I think it actually has been pretty effective. I'm very new on Twitter, but I caught the tail end of the Trump era, and I noticed that after he was banned, it was so much quieter and so much nicer of a place to be. Um, so I think that media companies have the power, but there have been lots of efforts to regulate media companies that have not been successful. So I think that we can't afford to wait any longer on media companies. We shouldn't give them more power in deciding how they regulate themselves. I think that that's a mistake on our part. I think what we have to do is focus on what we can do, which is in our education systems.
Absolutely, and education is the greatest tool, right? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So to transition into impeachment, which is maybe more of a recent development, um, on January 13th, the House impeached President Donald Trump for a second time, which is unprecedented.
Wow.
Uh, wow, just a moment to say wow,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
willful incitement of insurrection. However, there's still a debate between Republicans and Democrats as to whether Trump will be convicted within his Senate impeachment trial, which
Mhm.
we did not see the first time, obviously.
Yeah.
So the general question here is the impeachment going to cause a further division in American politics, or does it actually demonstrate a collaboration with with Republican and Democrat representatives?
You know, I think that we know that the first 100 days of a presidency are some of our most effective time moments and opportunities to get real policy change through. We saw that in the Obama administration and every administration before. And I think that, my grandparents recently got, um, they tested positive for COVID-19. And uh, speaking as someone who uh, knows what they're going through with, you know, um, a struggle to find basic healthcare, to pay for their small business, I think that COVID-19 relief and aid have to take a priority in Congress right now. And anyone who says that impeachment should be the priority, I think that they don't understand the seriousness of the situation. So I think that this is a valuable time for us to focus on COVID-19 and getting out of this crisis before we focus on the other crisis of our democracy. um, but at the same time, do I think that Congress can walk and chew gum at the same time? That's an overused phrase, of course, but I'm going to use it because I don't know a better way to say it. Yes, I do. And I hope that, and I hope and think that President Trump should be held accountable for his actions. We're talking about, you know, a precedent. Republicans are talking about a precedent of how, if we have impeachment, this may set a dangerous precedent for how we treat presidents in the future. This former president committed a crime, and he should be held accountable just like everyone else. You know, if you look at how our Congress is debating, basic truths right now, if we let a very attack on our democracy and our way of life slide, I think that that does nothing to increase our confidence in our systems of government, and I don't see how that creates unity.
Absolutely, and I think a big tenet of the foundation of our patriotism and American nationalism is that the president is not above the law. And that was
Yeah.
one of the founding principles of our democracy and our constitution.
Yeah,
And Shannon, please.
and I think you made a really good point where I do think that obviously there needs to be accountability for President Trump, and with impeachment or any other, federal or civil charges that follow suit. But I also think you make a good point where I think in this time of intense division, where this was like this one moment where Republicans and Democrats in the House and Senate were able to like unify and be like, okay, under a common like good for democracy. I think they could also focus on other policy initiatives with the number of like representatives that would be in support of it.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I would just like to take this time to wish your grandparent a speedy recovery. I'm so sorry to hear about that. This is a very scary time, absolutely. And I really appreciate you sharing that, as well as bringing a different perspective to light, because that is a perspective that I myself haven't heard reflected in the media. And I think it is especially I myself am based in Los Angeles County, which is the epicenter of the world. And it is the reality for many, many people, maybe more of a reality and would mean more than the conviction of Donald Trump in this moment.
Thank you so much for saying that, Mia.
Of course. And so, inauguration, and we did see a presidential inauguration, which is, we don't see one of those every day. It was especially in the time of a global pandemic.
Mhm.
And I personally think I think it was tastefully done, and I think it was everything that an inauguration should be, to stay in my nonpartisan Bruin Political Union lens. And my question for you is, do you believe that Joe Biden's speech emphasizing unity between Republicans and Democrats is a viable future within American politics?
Great question. And first of all, I remember the first time when I truly felt uh, a love for politics and in social change. It was third grade. Um, my my teacher clicked on the TV, and there was Obama's inauguration, and that was the first time that I remember just feeling like, wow, this is what a president does. This is awesome.
Mhm.
And so I inauguration was just it felt really special this time around. Um, the speech about unity, I think that um, it was a great speech. I don't think we usually hear a lot of great inauguration speeches, and I think that President Biden did an excellent job of making his case for the next 4 years. Uh, we've seen recently a pushback with Republicans against the majority, and a support of the filibuster. And whether or not the filibuster continues to exist, I think will play a huge part in whether or not we can unify our two parties. On one hand, I want to be able to say that uh, we're going to be able to make it through this more unified than ever. That when I say that, when I hear Biden say that, it makes me like, makes my heart swell with hope. But
Mhm.
at the same time, I as someone who has witnessed the past 4, 8, 16 years, I know that it's a very, very difficult thing to unify this country. Um, and going back to what we talked about before, I don't think that we can unify our country until we solve the issue of having the same truths, having the same facts in our lives. Um, and I also want to be the first, but probably not the last person in this podcast to mention Amanda Gorman. She said something amazing that has just stuck with me um, throughout these past few weeks. She said, uh, "This country is not, broken. We are just unfinished." And first of all, like what a beautiful poem that she said, but also I think that she's completely right, and I think that that was a very, very reassuring statement. Um, we, you know, are arcing towards justice, towards unity, and um, I think that you know a lot of people say that we're broken, but I don't think that it's completely impossible for us to unify if we can, come to the same facts, the same truths. I think that we can have incredible things happen.
I could not agree with you more. I think that there is a lot of valor to that perspective, and I don't think that there is any possibility of growth. I mean, not just within politics, within the American governmental system, but within yourself as a person, or my grade in neuroscience right now. I think that if you don't have that hope and that willingness to improve, to continue, then there is no growth to be had. Um,
Absolutely,
Can I
excellent.
mention something too? I
Yeah,
thought I really appreciate that you mentioning Amanda because I think it also shows a good demonstration. I think a lot of times for the youth, we're not necessarily encouraged to participate in politics because there's always a connotation that we don't know enough. Because I think the average age in the House of Representatives and the Senate is around 50. And so I think obviously we're far from being 50 years old. So I think there's always a connotation that we shouldn't be involved because we don't have enough knowledge. We're not in the real world yet, quote unquote. So I think it was really great seeing a youth like and participate and be an active participant within the political system in the United States.
absolutely, Shannon. And I just want to like compliment you guys on what you're doing here. You said the exact thing that a lot of people discourage young people from being in politics, but that's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. In order to gain experience in politics, in order to like have a better sense of what we're talking about, at times we may come off naive, but we're not going to learn unless we actually are in politics. And um, I also think that young people have way more to contribute than we're given credit for. We are the people that have recently been in our education system. We are the people that, have had the most we've seen the most effects of our social media, of our, again, the education system. uh I focus on education just because I'm an education policy person, but I think that we have to engage ourselves in politics, in policy, because the stakes are so high right now that we can't afford um, to stand on the sidelines anymore.
And I love that you tied into education. Being raised by, I myself am raised by educators, and I am a student, so I'm surrounded with educators and people who are proponents of education, whether I like it or not, which I do. Um, and I do believe that there is no growth to be had in society without a solid education system, and I think that it is. Maybe an area where the United States could use a little bit of, TLC, to put it kindly. And
Yeah,
I am hoping that you will go into education, because from your answers that I have heard on this podcast thus far, I am hopeful.
thank
Hopeful
you.
of the American education system being introduced.
And by the way, you guys are doing a great job with this podcast. I am so excited to see this thing grow. So I hope that you guys continue to do this.
Well, thank you very much, Adrian. And with that, I will transition into our conclusion, where I am going to say thank you profusely and again. Um, we are, as you know, very new. We are sort of in the infantile stages of this podcast, and you are our first guest. You are, you are the beginning.
I have no idea.
Yes, you are our first guest, and what a
Yeah.
guest you have been. I have thoroughly enjoyed what feels like grilling you, I'm sure, but also listening to your answers and your contributions. They were so well thought out. Brought such an incredible perspective, and I myself, as a student and as a person, find a lot of value in what you had to say, and I'm sure that the listeners and that BPU as an organization will also put as much stock into what you said as I did. So again, thank you so much. And I would just, if you have any final remarks, concluding remarks, be my guest.
If um if these guys ask any of our listeners to be guests, accept, because they are great and they do a great job.
That was a really great segue, Adrian, because I just want to let you know if anyone who's listening to the podcast has any suggestions regarding video ideas, what information you would like to see, or what guests to invite to the podcast, as Adrian mentioned, you can contact the Bruin Political Union at bpu@g.ucla.edu. So thank you so much for participating in the podcast and, about restoring civility in American politics. And I want to wish everyone a happy day. And yeah,
Thank
Great.
you guys.
Good luck on
bye.
midterm.